Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something really fundamental to how we, sort of see the world and understand it, particularly when it comes to the African continent. We're talking about economic statistics
Mhm.
and more specifically, gross domestic product, or GDP. It's that number you always hear about, right,
Yeah,
when countries are being ranked. Compared to each other, their economic health assessed all that.
absolutely. GDP has become the primary metric, I would say,
Hmm.
for gauging and comparing the economic standing of nations. It really underpins so many conversations
Hmm.
around development and aid allocation and
Yeah.
policy formulation.
Yeah, and you, our listener, you're not content with just the surface level. You want to really dig deeper, understand how things actually work. You're looking for knowledge that's both efficient and comprehensive, and that's precisely what we're aiming for. Because while GDP is this sort of, ubiquitous measure that we all kind of hear about, the methods behind it and its true meaning, I think, in the African context are often not very well understood.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's really the heart of our discussion today.
Right.
How dependable are these GDP figures? What are the consequences if they're not as precise as we often assume them to be? And how does this impact our understanding of development and the decisions made by those in power?
Yeah, to get to the bottom of all of this, we're diving headfirst into this
Yeah.
really fascinating study called Poor Numbers. It really pulls back the curtain on the world of African economic data.
Yeah.
Author Morten Jerven conducted really extensive interviews with folks at you know, national statistical offices and central banks and donor missions across uh, 8 different African nations. Let's line it. Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia.
Okay.
Plus, he compiled a continent-wide survey results and really rigorously compared all these different international data sets.
Yeah. It's a really in-depth investigation, getting right to the source of the numbers.
Yeah.
And what emerges are some genuinely surprising insights. We were talking about how data collection can sometimes be quite subjective, the political forces that can really shape the figures, and just the sheer difficulty of trying to accurately measure economic activity in these diverse, rapidly evolving economies across Africa.
Yeah. So let's start kind of basic here. Where do these GDP numbers actually come from? What's the sort of system that's behind them?
So theoretically, the measurement of national income follows a globally recognized standard called the UN System of National Accounts, or the SNA.
Okay.
And
Okay.
this framework actually has its origins way back, of the League of Nations back in 1939, with some key early work done by Richard Stone. The first formal version of this appeared in 1953. And while there have been some updates since then, the fundamental principles have really remained remarkably consistent.
Okay, so this SNA, this is like the official playbook then for calculating things like GDP and gross national income, which are, these crucial indicators we use to understand a country's economic development and growth.
Precisely. GDP, in theory, represents the total value of all the value-added activities within a country over the course of a year, divided by its population and then adjusted to account for price changes.
Okay.
It sounds fairly straightforward, but that's really where the sort of ideal theoretical scenario meets the often messy realities on the ground.
Yeah, because even in well-established economies, we know there are all kinds of limitations. Think about, economic activities that just aren't officially recorded. The fact that, a full count of the population might only happen once every 10 years. And then, accurately tracking changes in prices is a huge challenge in and of itself.
Absolutely. And when we turn our focus to African countries in particular, these inherent challenges, I think, are often amplified considerably. This book really makes a strong case that African GDP statistics should frequently be viewed as best estimates rather than these precise definitive measurements.
Okay, that makes you stop and think a little bit.
Yeah.
There's some really telling kind of anecdotes in this book, like the comparison from the Kenyan Central Statistical Office. They likened GDP calculation to simply counting oranges in a bag, highlighting just how much of an aggregation and a rough estimate it really is.
That's a perfect illustration. And then there's the even more sort of direct example from the Lusaka Statistical Office, way back in 1978. They actually used single and double asterisks in their official national accounts publications to denote guesstimates with varying degrees of certainty.
Wow.
So you had officially published figures that were, in essence, flagged as we're really not sure about how accurate this is.
Yeah, so the reliability of these GDP figures isn't just about the sort of mathematical formula that's being used, but it really depends on the quality of the raw data that's feeding into those calculations.
Exactly. So these departments are responsible for producing these national accounts. They rely on this wide array of data from different parts of the national statistical system, figures on population and agricultural and industrial output, price data, and so on. And the trustworthiness of the underlying data is often really limited by available resources and sheer accessibility. How many trained personnel are there to actually collect this data?
Yes.
What's the budget allocated for it? Often they're relying on data provided by other government ministries or even private sector entities.
Which, as you said earlier, opens the door to, a whole new set of potential issues and inconsistencies.
Absolutely.
And then we have this really critical aspect of the base year in GDP estimation. Can you explain why selecting a particular base year is so important?
Sure. So the base year essentially establishes a reference point.
Yeah.
It determines
Yeah.
the relative importance,
Yeah.
proportional share of different sectors within the economy.
Yeah.
So if your chosen base year is outdated or not truly representative of the typical economic structure, for instance, if it's a year marked by a severe drought, that significantly impacted agricultural output. That could really seriously distort your growth figures in subsequent years. This is known as the index number problem.
Right.
Precisely. So if a sector that's experiencing rapid growth, say like mobile telecommunications or a newly emerging export industry, had a relatively small presence in that base year, its actual contribution to overall economic growth will likely be underestimated until a more current base year is adopted.
Yeah.
And the calculations are revised,
Right.
conversely. A base year that reflects an unusually strong performance in a particular sector could artificially inflate subsequent growth figures when that sector returns to a more normal level, so relying solely on GDP growth figures without really understanding. The base year can give a completely misleading picture
Of actual economic changes. Yeah, and the book really hammers this point home by showing us a comparison of per capita GDP rankings from 3 major international sources: Madison, the World Development Institute, and the Penn World Tables.
And what's really striking is the degree of disagreement among them, while they might concur, on the ranking of the very poorest country, say the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are significant discrepancies in the rankings of many others: Guinea, Mozambique, Liberia, Angola, just to name a few. Some countries can shift up or down by as many as 20 places in the global rankings, depending on which of these widely cited data sets you happen to be looking at.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember, as the book points out, these aren't truly independent, globally collected data sets in the way one might imagine. They are, in fact, compilations of national data, often with their own distinct methodologies for adjustments and their own chosen base years.
Exactly. The UN Statistical Office was the initial primary collector of this kind of data. But over time, especially after the oil crises of the 1970s, the consistency and timeliness of the national data that they were receiving really began to suffer.
Okay.
This led to growing frustration on the part of the World Bank, which subsequently decided to start publishing its own estimates of gross national income per capita. And these figures sometimes directly contradicted the official data being reported by the countries themselves.
And because the World Bank's figures often appeared to be more current, they gained a lot of prominence, even if their underlying methods
of data collection weren't necessarily, more rigorous. It really highlights how the perceived authority and timeliness of data can sometimes overshadow that crucial question of its actual accuracy.
Absolutely.
Which leads us to think about the historical context here. National income accounting in Africa. Isn't this deeply rooted tradition? South Africa was the first to publish national accounts back in 1945, with a few other countries following suit in the late 40s and 50s. And in those early days, there was quite a bit of debate and skepticism about whether these Western concepts of income and welfare were even relevant or accurately applicable to the very different social and economic structures found across Africa. Yeah, there were genuine intellectual discussions about the appropriateness and the precision of these measures. Some scholars even argued that trying to compare income levels across countries with such vastly different cultural norms and economic foundations is fundamentally flawed. Perhaps even as meaningful as trying to compare, maximizing financial profit to maximizing one strategic position in a game of chess. The underlying rules and the ultimate goals were just too different.
Right, but then that narrative kind of shifted, didn't it? In the 1960s and 70s, national accounts became absolutely central to the field of development, economics, GDP, and economic growth. Effectively became the defining characteristics and the primary targets of
what
state.
Development was supposed to be. Exactly. And with this official endorsement and this widespread adoption, there was arguably less critical examination of the underlying methodologies and potential inaccuracies than there had been. With those earlier, more independent estimates, the formalization of national income accounting lent an aura of scientific objectivity, even if the basic data being collected hadn't improved dramatically.
The book talks about the lost decades of the 1980s and 90s, a period, marked by significant economic crises. And the implementation of these structural adjustment policies, how did that sort of turbulent period impact the quality of the economic data?
It was a really damaging time, I think, for the institutional capacity of statistical offices in many countries. So the structural adjustment programs, aimed to stimulate economic growth. The international financial institutions often neglect to adequately fund
or support
the form of these national statistical systems. And simultaneously, as formal economic sectors were contracting, informal economies were expanding rapidly, which made accurate measurement incredibly challenging. In countries like Mozambique and Cameroon, privatization even led to a loss of access to previously collected data on things like export volumes and customs revenues. So the capacity to accurately track economic activity was really being eroded during this period.
So basically the ability to gather even just basic economic information was compromised.
Precisely. Now, interestingly, the book points out that in the late 1990s, following some of these structural adjustments, countries like Zambia and Tanzania undertook significant upward revisions of their reported national income. This is, in effect, an acknowledgement of the substantial underestimation that had occurred due to the previously largely unaccounted for activities within the informal sector.
So it's like these revisions, while they might bring the figures closer to reality, also introduce further complexities when we try to compare. Economic data over longer periods of time.
Absolutely. Because if methodologies and even the scope of what is being measured are changing significantly over time, it makes robust long-term trend analysis difficult. It's not always a straightforward comparison of like data points.
Okay, let's delve into some specific sectors here to illustrate these challenges, starting with something that's absolutely fundamental: population data. Nigeria in particular seems to have a really complex and politically charged history when it comes to these census figures.
This is a significant understatement. Accurate population counts are absolutely vital, not only for calculating total GDP and, of course, per capita measures, but also because they have significant political implications. They influence things like electoral representation and the allocation of government resources. This has resulted in a very long and contentious history surrounding Nigerian censuses, going all the way back to the colonial era, with issues of undercounting and evasion, and continuing into the post-independence period, with what the book describes as this race to be included, driven by the political and economic benefits associated with having larger population numbers.
So the reported population figures have varied quite dramatically over the decades, and even more recent census attempts, such as the one conducted in 2006, were met with considerable disputes and allegations of manipulation.
The president at the time even dismissed those who questioned the results as confusionists.
Wow.
And what's particularly revealing is this ongoing separation and an apparent lack of
strong collaboration
between the National Population Commission and the National Bureau of Statistics, reportedly. The Bureau itself fears that closer association with the MPC could damage its already somewhat fragile public credibility. And for its part, the MPC views this separation as a shame. It really underscores these deep-seated issues of trust and reliability surrounding this very fundamental population data.
So if these, really fundamental data points are unreliable, how much confidence can we really have in the overall GDP figure as this measure of progress? And if you don't have a reliable population count, that inevitably throws off so many other crucial statistics, right? From poverty rates to, per capita indicators for health and education. It essentially becomes, as the book puts it, guesswork built on another layer of estimation.
Exactly. And the implications for, effective policymaking are enormous. I mean, how can you adequately plan for the provision of schools, healthcare facilities, vaccination programs if you don't have a reasonably accurate understanding
of the size and distribution
of the population you're trying to serve?
Moving on to agriculture, which remains a crucial sector for many economies across Africa. Nigeria, again, provides this compelling, if somewhat concerning, case study.
So the primary challenge here revolves around accurately measuring subsistence agricultural production, which for a long period was largely overlooked or inadequately captured in these official statistics. And even when efforts were made to collect this data, there were often massive inconsistencies. So the book highlights discrepancies in the reported production figures for staple crops like cassava and maize, not just, when comparing data from different organizations, like the Federal Office of Statistics and the FAO. But even within the same institution, across different official publications, released only a few years apart, we're talking about differences amounting to millions of tons in reported output.
Wow, that's a huge level of inconsistency. And those kinds of discrepancies, even if they don't fundamentally alter the headline GDP figure by a huge margin, would have very significant real-world implications for things like transportation infrastructure planning, food distribution networks, and overall food security assessments.
Absolutely. And the book also points out that sometimes these significant revisions in agricultural production data aren't even based on really conducted or updated surveys of crop yields or planted acreage. So in Nigeria's case, this substantial upward revision in agricultural output data between the 1995 and 1999 statistical abstracts wasn't supported by any corresponding changes. In the reported yield or acreage figures, it raises serious questions about the basis for these significant adjustments.
Malawi offers another interesting example. In the context of its fertilizer subsidy program, how did that initiative potentially skew the agricultural data being reported?
So the fertilizer subsidy program created this very strong incentive to overstate agricultural output figures. So the government naturally wanted to demonstrate the success of the program, both to its own electorate and to the international donors who were providing significant financial support. The book highlights this stark contrast between maize output figures reported in the 2010 agricultural census and earlier data from the Ministry of Agriculture, revealing a major discrepancy in the number of agricultural households used for aggregation. There were even anecdotal reports of ghost farmers being invented in order to qualify for subsidies, creating these incentives for both farmers and local officials to inflate the reported numbers.
So if a country's economy shifts dramatically, say from agriculture to tech, and the base year still heavily weights agriculture, our growth figures might be painting this completely outdated picture.
Exactly. So the prevailing political and economic context can directly influence the data that's being reported. It's not simply a neutral or purely technical exercise of data collection and calculation.
Right, which brings us to this crucial area of methodological issues and the fundamental question of transparency. How are these GDP numbers actually calculated in practice? And is that process sufficiently clear and accessible to those who need to use and interpret the data?
So the book uses the case of Tanzania to illustrate how the choice of different constant price series in base years can lead to
dramatically different pictures of economic growth over the very same time period. We're talking about 4 different constant price series, yielding quite distinct narratives of Tanzanian economic growth. And this lack of awareness among some researchers about these purely statistical artifacts. It's even led to
the drawing of erroneous conclusions about supposed output shocks in the Tanzanian economy that were in reality simply a consequence of the different statistical methodologies being employed.